many times we've had interesting discussions on all parts of the world, including China and the region. And I know Tim's been a great expert on Hong Kong, China, and the area, having been very successful in business there. China, of course, is the most fascinating part of the world. It's grown absolutely exponentially over the last few years. All sorts of challenges and impacts on us in Western Europe and on our society as well. And of course, Tim has written this very interesting book, Stumbling Giant, The Threat to China's Future. He's going to be talking about this this afternoon and then answering some questions on it. I'm sure we'd all be fascinated to hear what he has to say. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. It's a great pleasure to be back at the Side Business School. It's very kind of so many people to give up what seems to be rather a nice summer's afternoon to come into this room and discuss the future of China. I'd like to say a little bit about the book very briefly, that having seen the extraordinary rise in China over the last 30 years, I thought it was quite interesting to explore what may happen over the coming decades. And I concentrated on the areas that could represent a challenge to the continuation of China's rise. And there are really a lot of challenges that are potentially coming down towards China. Some are very clear now, and some are not. For me, the largest challenge is that of demography. And this really comes in 4 different forms. The first is that having experienced for many decades a rising labour force and wages which never changed, which allowed China to become the low-cost manufacturing centre for the entire world. This situation has changed in recent years, because since the early 1970s, we've had a 40% reduction in the number of births per year. And as a result, that's now showing up in the number of new entrants into the labour force. So the total labour force in China is now becoming smaller each year. And the impact of that is double-digit wage rises. And this, of course, is forcing China into a situation where it's less competitive, and it really needs to rethink its business model to get away from cheap manufacturing and move towards a more knowledge-based economy, an innovation-led economy. But unfortunately, this is something that China has not found it very easy to do. So this is a real challenge. The second aspect is that China is now an aging society. In 2010, there were over 100 million Chinese over 65, but by 2040 it will be over 300 million. And of course, traditionally, this hasn't been a huge problem because older people have been looked after by their children, looked after often at home. But now, with the configuration of a typical Chinese family, of one adult, with 2 parents alive, and sometimes 4 grandparents now alive, with increasing longevity, better health, longer life. With 2 adults, potentially, there are now 12 elderly to think about. And it's no longer feasible to invite them to stay in the spare room. So now we have to really consider institutional care, which has not been a tradition in China at all. And at the moment, 1.5% of over 65s are in institutional homes. I think by 2040, we'll be looking at a third to a half of what by then will be 300 million, and therefore 150 million people. So a huge change from 1 million people in care today to maybe 150 million in just over 25 years' time. There's a big budgetary impact in this, and of course China may be the second largest economy in the world, but it's by no means possessing the second largest budget. China's budget is much more similar to that of France. So there will be substantial decisions to be made by China in the coming years about policy options because of budgetary constraints. The third area is gender disparity. Over the last 20 years, 6 boys have been born for every 5 girls on average in China. And this means that over the next 2 decades we should expect there to be something between 40 and 50 million men who will not get married. And of course it doesn't mean 1 in 6 men will not get married, because women tend to make decisions, and women tend to decide that they're going to marry men who are a little bit better off, or a little bit more intelligent, or a little bit better looking. So what it really means is that maybe 1 in 2.5 of men who are poorer, stupider, uglier, are not going to get wives. And these people are going to be coming into the cities angry, unhappy, and this is already beginning to show up in crime statistics in some of the major cities, and it's going to get more and more serious. And of course, those numbers can't really change because people have been born. We know what the ratios are. No government policy can quickly change this. It's really set. So there is the potential for growing instability in urban areas through this phenomenon over some decades. And the fourth demographic pressure for China is that of the trend in the entire population. But China's population has been growing despite the one-child policy, but it's expected that it will peak by about 2027. In the early 2020s, the population of China will be overtaken by that of India, which will then become the most populous country in the world. That has some implications, because at the moment China gets a very large part of the world's foreign direct investment from multinational companies investing in China. Virtually every company of any size in the world has a China strategy. But as we move towards the 2020s, a lot of companies will feel the need to have an India strategy and will start to increase their capital investments in India, which at the moment is very low down the list. So there will be inevitably some change in the focus of international investment, a reduction in interest in China, but still a lot of interest, a large increase proportionally in the investments into India. But the most important thing, when the population peaks in the late 2020s, is that of course it's going to start to fall. And this is because of what's happening to fertility rates in China and what's happening to the number of women of the age that they can have children. And these things can be projected reasonably easily. We're going to see falls. The most modest expectation is that of the United Nations, which suggests that by the end of this century, by 2100, the population of China will have fallen by 1/3, from 1.4 to 950 million people. All the other forecasts are for much more substantial falls, down to a fall of 2/3, bringing it to 550 million people. At which point America will have somewhere between 400 and 500 million people, because its demography is very different. It's a modestly growing country, whereas China will be a fast shrinking country in population terms. So at the moment, for example, there are 4 Chinese for 1 American. By the end of the century, we could be looking at 1.2. So a very different world by the end of this century, where technology becomes more important and scale becomes less important. But I think the biggest point to make here is that I'm not aware of any society in history which has had a sharp fall in its population and has been able to sustain high economic growth rates. I think we should expect that even if China manages to pull out all the stops to do all sorts of improvements to its economy, it would be a heroic achievement to see the 2030s in which China might match current European growth rates. So when we talk about China going from this 10% growth rate over the last 30 years, we're now looking at 7, 8%. Whatever happens in the next few years, the long term is inevitably going to be a move towards substantially lower growth rates than we have now. And I feel that China must prepare for this. And any challenges that China has in front of it, which are soluble challenges, because for me demography is something that cannot be reversed, but any soluble, important challenges need to be tackled while China has the financial resources to tackle them. And that means while there is still some semblance of high growth. Unfortunately, while in the 1980s and the 1990s, China was the fastest reforming country in the world, by 2000, that reform had petered out. There have really been no significant reforms in China from 2000 until now. So what China really needs to do, in my view, is to re-engage with reform and tackle some of the major issues that are now in front of it. Perhaps I'll just touch on a few of them, because we haven't got the time to deal with all of China's challenges. But I'll just talk about three areas. One, of course, is the environment. China has the worst environment of any major economy in the world. The pollution of the air, the water, the soil, and the lack of security in the food chain combine to make it, in many ways, a very dystopic society. Pollution has been noted by leaders in China for more than 20 years. But while it's been lamented and policy action has been called for, and we've had quite a lot of legislation, good quality legislation brought in China, the end result has still been that the environment has deteriorated consistently over the last 20 years. So we're not getting the right results, despite it being quite apparent to government officials about the nature of the problem. And of course, environmental problems lead to public disorder. China is estimated to have over 180,000 riots every year, and a large number of those, we're told by the government, are caused by people who are angry at environmental issues. So there is the potential for this to get worse and worse if it isn't tackled. And it has economic impacts as well, of course, because if we just take water, for example, water is not priced to market because of a legacy of socialist economics where resources were underpriced. Although there have been some attempts to price it to market, it hasn't been fully done. And there's a lot of waste in the system. So the biggest use of water at the moment in China is for agriculture, because China irrigates 50% of its farmland, whereas America irrigates 10%. One of the reasons for that isn't so much China's climate, it's because of rapid urbanization, which means fertile farmland becomes urban development, and it has to be replaced by less fertile farmland in more remote areas on mountain sides, which then requires a lot of chemical fertilizer, which then seeps into the water system. So there are a lot of knock-on impacts of changing social development in China. But this use of water, 55% of the water used in agriculture does not get to the point of use. So there's a rather aggressive plan in the current 5-year plan to 2015 that the loss of water in agriculture will be reduced sharply from 55 to 53%. Not every target in the national plans gets achieved, unfortunately. But the draining of aquifers under major cities is causing subsidence. And the area of subsidence in China is double that in the United States for the same size land. And it's growing, and it's irreversible, according to the geologists. So you've got problems with the Beijing metro, where sensors have to be put in to note the degree of subsidence. There are problems with the high-speed railways in North China. There are problems with Beijing and Shanghai airports. So subsidence is a problem all across China, even as far as Tibet or Xinjiang. Because water is just continually being depleted, it's being consumed far faster than it's appearing. And one of the solutions that China has looked at is the fact that, of course, it has military control of the Tibetan Plateau. And the Tibetan Plateau is where a lot of the world's major rivers arise. The Brahmaputra, the Obi in Russia, the Mekong, the Salween in Burma, the Indus. So the idea has been for many years that it would be good to divert some of this water through channels to northern China. There was even a plan at one stage to use nuclear power to blow a hole in the Himalayas to facilitate this channeling of water. But one of the problems is that a third of the world drinks the water that rises on the Tibetan Plateau. India, Southeast Asia, Burma, Russia. These people are nervous about the diversion of that water. So it's storing up the potential for conflict in the region. So the environment doesn't only affect Chinese people, it affects its relationship with the neighborhood. And of course, with the erosion through wind and water of farmland in China, because of the deforestation of China, there's huge erosion. And if you imagine the American Dust Bowl in the 1930s lost 850 million tons of soil in a year, China loses over 5 times that every single year. That goes as far as Korea or Japan. Of course, with the prevailing winds across the Pacific, a lot of China's chemical pollutants from factories end up in the United States, an unwelcome import. I think 20% of mercury that is found in American soil has come from China. The sky goes red at night over San Francisco because of the particulates that arrive from China. So China's environmental impact is not only a domestic issue, it's a global issue. Another thing that I've mentioned as a challenge for China to deal with is this question of the move to innovation, because it really isn't happening. China is increasingly exporting high-tech products, but 83% of them are made by foreign companies operating inside China. They're not being made by Chinese companies using Chinese technology. China may be the largest car market in the world, but the top 10 brands that are sold in China are all foreign brands using foreign technology made by foreign companies, or joint ventures under foreign leadership. So we're not seeing this technology that we need to create a new model. And I think that one of the areas that needs to be considered is the whole form of education in China, which heavily leans towards rote learning, rather than the critical thinking with which countries overseas are more familiar. And this is because of things like the Gaokao, the university entrance examination, which is very focused on rote learning. And as a result, China does not have one university in the top 100 in the world, and yet it's the second largest economy. There are lots of very, very bright Chinese scholars, and I've met a lot of them, but somehow the university system in China doesn't seem to benefit from them the way that it should. China has created a huge number of universities. It's built one new university every 3 days for the last 8 years. There's no shortage of them. The trouble is they're not very good. And one of the problems in Chinese university education, of course, is that there were 600,000 graduates at the end of 1990. We're now 7 million. We're getting an awful lot of people out of the system, but as a result, graduate unemployment is anywhere between 30 and 45%. Depending on how you break it down. And this is a really high figure. Graduate unemployment is a problem everywhere in the world. I mean, in Korea, a third of students over the last 5 years have ended up working on assembly lines. In China, over a third of the students haven't got jobs at all. And the average graduate salary in China is lower than the average migrant labourer's wage. Clearly there's something going wrong. There are obviously pockets of excellence in Chinese education, and there are pockets of great innovation in China in areas like supercomputers, the genome, 3D printing, space technology. Lots of areas where China does very well, but overall it's a weak picture. There's been a feeling that China must win a lot of patents, and a lot of patents have subsequently been won by Chinese people, but they're often patents that incremental change to existing processes rather than totally innovative patents. Also, there's been a strong drive to publish scientific papers, and China has swamped the world with scientific papers. A very high proportion of them now by Chinese scientists. But there are 200 countries whose scientific papers are more frequently cited by other scientists than the papers from China. I think one of the problems is that there's a culture of plagiarism in the academic world in China. And maybe this is part of the tradition. I think Confucius at one stage said that I'm really a compiler of information. But of course this is not the kind of science that brings you a Nobel Prize. So I think that there really needs to be a serious look at the education system that feeds the scientific culture of China, if we're going to make these breakthroughs for innovation, for branding, for technology. And then thirdly, I'll just touch on the financial system in China. Although China has grown at maybe 10% a year for the last 30 years, it doesn't matter exactly what it was, but the private sector in 1980 was 3% of the economy, and now it's 70% of the economy. So if the economy has grown at 10% a year, the private sector has grown at over 20% a year. A tremendous achievement, fantastic achievement. I don't think anywhere in the world has done it well. But then it's arresting to consider that 70% of bank lending goes to state enterprises, not to the private sector. It's extraordinary to think that the stock market in China this week closed at the same level that it closed at 12 years ago. In other words, the stock market has not reflected any of this growth at all. And there's a very clear reason for that. Because 86% of the value of the Chinese stock market is state enterprises, not private sector companies. So you can't invest in these companies that are doing well because they're not encouraged to access the capital markets. But if the private sector hasn't been able to borrow money very easily, it hasn't been able to raise capital from the stock markets very easily, It's extraordinary what they've achieved over 30 years. And what would they have achieved if they had been able to do those normal things? Might the Chinese economy then have grown not at 10% a year in 30 years, but at 15%? I mean, it's an extraordinary thing to contemplate. But the system is dysfunctional. The financial system doesn't back the real economy. And if China is going to be successful, there has to be more integration between the financial system and the economic system of China. And also in the financial area, I just point out the question of foreign exchange reserves. Because people get very excited about foreign exchange reserves. 3.5 trillion is a very big number. It's very nice to have 3.5 trillion foreign assets. But I think we have to consider how China makes foreign exchange reserves. And really, they're made in two different ways. One is companies in China export more than they import, so they accumulate foreign currency. And at the end of the year, they're required to sell that to the Central Bank of China. So the Central Bank acquires foreign exchange and pays for it with local currency. The other way foreign exchange reserves are created is because China intervenes in currency markets, generally trying to stabilize, or the Americans would say, depress the Chinese currency by buying foreign currencies and selling Chinese currency. So again, they accumulate foreign exchange and they have to spend Chinese money. But China didn't start 20 years ago with 3.5 trillion of its own money and exchange it for dollars and euros. So where did it get the money to buy all this foreign exchange? The answer is that it's issued bonds domestically to insurance companies and banks, and also it requires the banking system in China to place reserves, prudential reserves with the central bank, which the central bank then uses to carry out these activities. So you have a system where China has 3.5 trillion of foreign exchange assets and something over 3 trillion of domestic currency liabilities. So there's $1 of borrowing for virtually every dollar of asset. So China isn't $3.5 trillion better off than everybody else. It's just in a situation where it has the most highly leveraged investment portfolio in the world, undiversified, in assets over which it has no control. It doesn't even have a director on the Fed or the European Central Bank. It has no say in those monetary policies. So it's short of the currency that it controls, and it's a highly leveraged investor in currencies that it doesn't control. I would say this is a very vulnerable position to be in. So I look at these things in a very different way, and I think China needs to find a way of gradually unwrapping itself from the situation in which it is. Because if the Americans are right, and the renminbi is underpriced, at some point over time, this is going to be reflected in substantial capital losses for China. Already the difference in interest rates between what they get on treasuries and what they're having to pay domestic providers of capital is costing them an estimated $66 billion a year. But a 10% move in the renminbi upwards would cost them $350 billion. It's a very uncomfortable position to be in. It may be that China doesn't believe its currency is going to go up, and there's quite a lot to be said from that point of view. But it's quite a dangerous bet to place, because nobody really knows. So I think the financial system is rather dysfunctional. There are deep weaknesses in education and scientific culture, and the environment is an ecological nightmare. All of these things are soluble, but they require money and they require urgency. And what I've tried to do in this book is to suggest that China should re-engage with reforms early, deeply and radically if it's going to be able to continue growing satisfactorily through the issues that are going to arise in the coming decades. Thanks.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Beardson. If anybody would like to ask Mr. Beardson questions, if you need the microphone, I can bring it to you, but I think it's quite difficult on doing here.
Well, just to sort of help start getting things going, I think that's wonderful. I apologise for arriving a bit late, and I think I missed the first of your sections. But you gave a brilliant account, it seems to me, although a very pessimistic one, of what you might call the hardware of Chinese kind of social society, social future. But if we shifted into the software, ideology, where some of the problems that may be standing in the way of the urgency, as you say, is required, where it's being blocked. Could you say something about your view of how you think China may evolve ideologically in terms of the kind of leading ideas, leading ways of thinking about how society, politics and life and culture should be organised?
I don't see China as an ideological society. I think it's a post-ideological society. I think China's problems are not ideological. I think one of the problems China has, and this may sound strange, is that unfortunately it's not a dictatorship. And therefore it's very difficult for people who lead the government of China to get done the things that they may feel that they should get done. The government of China is quite a broad, collective group of people. There are a lot of people who have a say in China's future. And it's very difficult to turn this whole mechanism around. And I see things like that as more of the problem. For me, it's not ideological, it's a question of governance. If the party has produced very good legislation on the environment, it's very galling to think that that legislation is not being implemented. And one sees this in many areas where things are just not getting done. And I think there are important issues to be grasped, like how more effectively to motivate local officials to carry out national policies. Because there are lots of pressures on local officials from all sorts of directions. I think there's a lot to be changed in the way government carries out the act of government. I think questions about the political system itself are not so relevant. The party has been extraordinarily effective for 30 years at adapting itself to changing circumstances. My concern is that it's become less adaptable and it's not addressing the issues as effectively as it did in the 80s and the 90s. So that for me is the important thing.
I very much enjoyed your remarks. I wanted you to say something about the amount that China is investing overseas at the moment, and is that actually a palliative that will allow this graceful degradation to go more slowly and actually give it the opportunity to, in some way, solve what I think is a huge underlying problem you highlight, which is the ability to innovate. So the ability to innovate must come at some stage, presumably, to the nature of society as it continues to develop, which has been in a stranglehold for many decades and centuries even. So it's almost, you are talking about a dip. I would offer an alternative thesis, which is a holding mechanism which it's embarking upon at the moment. It doesn't allow it to move so quickly, whilst it allows for an upswing with the innovation that I think you probably dispute will arise.
A complex question, Vice Marshal. we started with foreign investment. There's a lot of discussion of China's foreign investment. I think a lot of it comes from an innate lack of confidence in market mechanisms. The feeling that there are going to be a lot of fluctuations in the supply of raw materials or energy, which is a widely held view. But it goes with a view that the market mechanisms are not sufficiently robust that China can have the confidence that these will, over the years, deal with their needs. And so there's a rather mercantilist strategy that it's better that we own the pieces of land where these things arise. I have a concern with that strategy, that if, for example, one's insuring against future global food shortages, having 11,000 square miles of Zambia growing maize, are you really going to be able to take the last maize out of Zambia when people are starving all around you? I suspect that a lot of these investments will prove ultimately to be worthless. That's one concern. Another concern is that China's role in Africa has been neo-colonialist, bad for Africans, treating them badly. Actually, I think China's engagement with Africa has been largely pretty positive. There are things you can question, like the rather retro labour practices. If people strike, I think Chinese managers aren't always sure what to do. But it's generally a bad idea to get out the rifles. But I think that overall, they've done pretty well. And I think Africans feel that they're being treated more as an equal. That's probably never really the right expression. But that they feel that the Chinese come with open intentions. They're there to make money. They're not there to be charitable. But they do it in a way that Africa has largely benefited from. You can question whether it's a good idea to bring Chinese labour to Africa to carry out road building projects. Why not use African labour? But of course, the reason why Chinese labour is cheaper than African labour is that a lot of it is convict labour. It's come out of Chinese prisons, so it doesn't cost wages, and generally it's dumped at the end of the project in Africa. They then become entrepreneurs, and the richest man in Gabon, who's worth $1 billion, was originally a convict from China. So China's exports come in many shapes and sizes. But I think generally China has actually been a good force in Africa. Sorry, you asked me another question, which was about innovation. I think we can be optimistic about innovation, but a number of things have to happen. At the moment, they're not really happening. But it's a soluble problem. What we need is more critical thinking in the schools. We need less deference to senior people in the scientific culture. The oldest scientist in the room isn't the best scientist. The most senior guy isn't the best. We've got to break that deference, that sense of hierarchy, which is too apparent in Chinese science. In other countries, the best guy is the one who's the best guy. And that's the kind of thinking we need in Chinese science. There are lots of things that can be done, need to be done. I just like to see some signs that they aren't going to be done.
For people to have a redress against either incompetent local or central government, there has to be a court system with separation of power, which is bullied by the party. Is that going to happen?
Well, one of the problems, of course, with the one-party system of government is that the party does tend to want to be in charge of things that happen in the country. But there are ways of dealing with that. The difficulty at the moment is that the courts are generally under local control. So if your beef is with a local official doing something wrong, that local official probably has some say over the court. So you're probably not going to get a very just result. I think that one approach is to put the legal system squarely under central control, to remove it from the hands of local officials. I think that would be a huge step forward. in trying to get better justice into the legal system in China.
Well, I'm an amateur in these things, but I've been fascinated by what you've said. But one of the things I've heard about is the banking system, which you didn't mention, in China, is actually going to face a meltdown because of the overvaluation of the debts, as it were, that they have, or the money that they've pumped into state industries, and which are basically not performing at all, or very low rate.
I mean, it is a real risk. There are only so many things one can talk about in the limited time we had. It is a problem, but they did have it also in the 90s. And because of the pace of economic growth, assets and profits were able to rise to the level at which we could deal with bad debts.
So they're not going to face a sort of Japan.
Well, now what's happening, of course, is we're looking at lower growth and profitability may not grow by the extent that's necessary for these issues to be dealt with this time around. So it's a very real question. It's not clear whether they will or won't grow through it, but there is a track record that they were able to do that before.
Tim, you talked about the financial system. Where's Hong Kong sitting in it? Because there's still some animosity, certainly between northern Chinese and people from Hong Kong, that probably haven't embraced as much of the ability in Hong Kong into the mainland system as might have been helpful.
I'm not sure what animosity is a word I'd use. Obviously, people in southern China are lucky enough to benefit from one of the finest languages in the world, Cantonese. And they never quite understand why people in the rest of China don't entirely follow what they express. But that's the point of view. I wouldn't call it animosity. I don't think there's, and there are differences and distinctions, but I don't think there's anger and hostility.
No, but are they embracing the skill sets that Hong Kong has to offer?
There has been a change in development of skill sets in China over the years. But of course China came from a place that was very, very much out of the world economy. And where it is now is not where Hong Kong is or where Taiwan is. China is still quite a long way below that. And of course within China there are huge regional variations. People in Shanghai are much more sophisticated than people in rural counties in Sichuan or Gansu. When China is so big, it has huge variations, and urban income is over 3 times higher than rural income. I mean, that's a huge distinction in itself. I mean, income inequality in China is now bigger than the United States.
I have 2 questions. Thank you for the inspiring talk. The first question, in what sense do you think the demographic change problem is insoluble? If you're considering that China's one-child policy is relaxing in recent years, and also the age of retirement will be pushed later, definitely in next decade. And the second question is that in terms of environment problem, crisis, and also educational lack of innovativeness, and also the problem of financial system, all of these problems seem to center or depend on a central-local relationship, whether or not the central legislation will be implemented by local, or to be more precise about whether the vested interests in Chinese society will be broken up in the coming future. So in that sense, why do you think it's soluble? Because to a lot of Chinese observers and to a lot of Chinese living in China, the vested interest is so strong and so entrenched in the system that it seems insoluble to break them up. So I'd like to hear your thoughts. Thank you.
It's very interesting. So what I describe as insoluble might be soluble, and what I describe as soluble might be insoluble. So I could be 100% wrong in everything I say. I'm not sure. On the demography, yes, governments can change policies, But I would make the observation that the one-child policy that came in 1979 has had no effect whatsoever on the size of China's population. And that may sound an odd thing to say, because it's quite a draconian piece of legislation. It has been described as the most extreme piece of social legislation in world history. The reason why it's had no effect is that China's birth rate had halved by 1979. And the subsequent fall that China's had in its birth rate has been more or less exactly paralleled by falls in birth rates in Hong Kong, Singapore, Taiwan and Korea, which have no one-child policy. And the reason I would suggest why the birth rates have been falling during that period haven't been that one-child policy. They've been endogenous social factors such as urbanization. People go from larger houses in the country to smaller ones in the towns, more expensive, no extra bedrooms for extra children, more women in the workforce. Lots of things that have an impact. People marrying later. All sorts of trends like that seem to have had an effect across the whole of East Asia, which has one of the sharpest falls in birth rate generally of any region in the world. The one effect I would say the one-child policy has had on China has been because the state has interfered with individual families' reproduction decisions, and sometimes we're told by the state media in China there have been many cases of officials forcibly taking a second child and putting them into orphanages, or forced abortions. The one effect I can say the one-child policy has had is that it has damaged the relationship between the Chinese state and tens of millions of Chinese people. So in that sense, it's had a negative impact. But I would say there have been no redeeming positive impacts. But on a wider front, the other aspects of demography are long-term changes in fertility rate, long-term changes, therefore, in birth rate, population trends. These things don't change, they don't move around very much. And the United Nations once said that these things are 100-year cycles. I'm not sure how long the cycles are, but the point is that they're not something that a quick government policy change is going to have an impact on. So I do regard it as largely an insoluble thing. I think there will be palliatives, there will be things we can do to ameliorate the situation, to take the rough edges of it. If China had a war, they'd probably get rid of some of these single 50 million men. That would be a good idea, except we don't necessarily want to have a war. But these are palliatives on an unsatisfactory, a rather sharply bad long-term trend. Are my solubles really insoluble? No, I don't put it down to a battle between the centre and the regions, because, for example, the private sector can't access the stock market because the National Development and Reform Commission, rather unusually named body, doesn't encourage access to the stock market. Now, that could be changed by government decision. The stock market can be thrown open to vibrant, good quality private sector companies. The banks could be told, we want you to increase your lending to the private sector. These are all perfectly doable things. Of course, there has to be a quid pro quo. Private sector companies have to start producing proper accounts and paying proper taxes, which is all to the benefit of the state, because China doesn't get enough budgetary income. So by allowing them to float on the stock market, you force them to push up the reported profits and therefore push up their contribution to the state. So there are lots of silver linings to all these things. I think innovation, education are all soluble. Even the environment can be cleaned up if only all of them will to engage. But there aren't huge vested interests, you're absolutely right, but they can be taken on.
Shall we just have one more question from yourself?
Tim, can I press you a bit on the answers you've given to the two explicitly political questions you've had? You talked mostly about policy and problems, but in answer to the very first question, ideological software, you gave the answer that, well, it's not quite the right question. The party is not a very centralised dictatorship, and lots of, politely we call them checks and balances, they're probably vetoes. And the party is blocked. And in answer to a question which is more kind of Western and constitutional governance, you focused your answer pretty much explicitly on the separation of powers as far as the judiciary is concerned, and I'm sure that's a big deal in terms of problems of corruption. But I'd really like to hear, what you think about the future of the political system, the main features of the political system, the future of the party, the future prospects for genuinely contested elections right up to the top, the possibility of representative government and the possibility of some kind of policy unblocking that comes through major political change.
Well, I did make the observation, but I think if the party were again to show the adaptability that it showed in the 80s and the 90s, it could position itself to continue to run China for many decades to come. But of course, if you're running a one-party state, people expect you to be pretty much right, pretty much all the time. There's not much leeway, and it becomes tougher and tougher as the decisions get harder and harder. So it's not going to be very easy, but it isn't impossible for the party to still be there in 50 years' time. But they do have to take tough and brave actions. And I've just seen a cessation of bravery in recent years. I don't think it's inevitable that China becomes a democracy in the next few years. I don't think it's inevitable that you can't have growth unless you have democracy. I don't think these are accurate statements. But I think it's quite difficult for the party to actually continue to make the reforms that it used to make, because and arguably one of the reasons why it ran out of steam at the end of the 90s was that it was no longer a leader with the charisma of Deng Xiaoping, who would successfully help to win a revolutionary war and had a lot of authority. And also you could argue at the same time that the first reforms were the low-hanging fruit. By the time you got to the end of the 90s, the reforms increasingly came with a political price. And yet the leaders in charge were people who had a very different history from Deng Xiaoping. They'd come up through a more bureaucratic environment where you have to be nice to the guy who's above you, and you keep doing that all your career, and then suddenly you're at the top. And you've had no real training for being in charge. So I think the combination of more timid leaders and more politically difficult reforms accounts largely for why reforms ground to a halt. So why should we assume that now the same kind of institutional system which has produced today's leaders will allow them to take on politically charged reforms? And either we have to say that Xi Jinping or Li Keqiang are just dedicated and committed and will just see all this through and they really want to reform, and all the people around them will allow this to happen. And I think that's not at all clear or a given. So it's not that easy to say the party will, of course, make all the necessary reforms. And I say in the book that I see no evidence right now that the party is making those reforms, and therefore I suggest that it's highly likely China will get caught in what the economists call the middle-income trap. It won't actually continue this rise. But that doesn't mean it will automatically move on and become a different political system.
Shall we continue the conversation in the lobby with